Yes.
Yes.
Perfect.
So a very good afternoon to everyone. Very delighted to be here amongst this audience, distinguished members of the jury. So I'll go straight into the presentation because of time constraints. So 75% of the world, as we know, lives in the global south. And in the global south, knowledge production resides in ecosystems that are not fully captured in formal institutions. So this project really is about the impact of under-researching alternative models of knowledge production and mobilization. So my team and I propose to create a comprehensive global platform and network to unify some of these different sites where knowledge is produced and mobilized and disseminated in the global south. Now, this knowledge production process in the south looks fundamentally different from the north. So the first step really is to study how such processes work. How do we act on what we know? It really depends on how knowledge is produced and where it is situated. So I'll illustrate with an example. Consider economic reforms and debts. The bulk of the university or institutional top-down research tends to focus on macroeconomic implications and also tend to ignore household debts. For many borrowers, loan recovery is done through the full force of criminal laws, something that's actually expressly prohibited under the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. Yet countries which have essentially ratified some of those laws, countries as diverse as India, Nigeria, Egypt, all lean on similar approaches to debt recovery, right? And often disadvantaged groups, including women, are particularly affected by these legal regimes. So the university-centric model associated with the global north gives us an incomplete picture. In the global south, universities are not necessarily at the heart of knowledge creation, and that happens for a host of reasons. It could be political capture of institutions, lack of academic freedom, real resource constraints, and limited access to certain networks, which would help develop expertise. So knowledge mobilization is then widely dispersed. Sometimes they're in precarious sites, and sometimes they mobilize through actors, a host of actors. And I'll give you some examples to illustrate this. So looking at a single site is actually quite limiting. So the dominant model of creating knowledge has been built around assumptions about a simple transfer of knowledge and models from the north to the south. But we do not believe that it will solve this problem. And some of us have come together through sort of establishing an international network across the globe. I've provided a map which kind of tells you where some of us are situated. There's actually a much wider network beyond it. And we've been working for some years, and we have shared concerns about these blind spots. And there's also a general disenchantment about representation and agency. So for us, this is not a race for the global south to catch up with the north. It's about recognizing the plural sites of knowledge production in the global south, something that will integrate and transform knowledge globally. So we observe a distinctive phenomenon in the south where policy, practice, and academia overlaps through a constellation of actors. So let me explain this. Academics in the South, in many cases, often wear multiple hats. They operate in the traditional research spaces, but also practice. They're connected to local knowledge centers, activists, movements, community organizations, and so on. So the overlaps and exchanges between these actors generate knowledge, mobilizes it, and even lay the foundations for calls to action. A good example of this is the climate justice movements, and we see this around the world. These movements are transnational, and we may find otherwise segmented actors like lawyers, activists, academics, all coming together and often mobilizing despite very material risks to themselves, their organizations, and sometimes their families. So our early research is demonstrating how schoolactivists innovate models of knowledge production and mobilization. So they help integrate and strengthen the links between formal knowledge and tacit knowledge on the ground that's gained through experience of these actors on the ground. So studying this model then offers the ability to develop innovative frameworks that can systematize and recognize the different types of tacit knowledge. So again, I'll illustrate. On the surface, we may not find an obvious connection between the work of a researcher that is studying sedimentation rates in mangrove forests and a human rights activist who's protesting against the state or against state-sponsored or corporate land grabs. A specific example of that is an illustration through the Bangladesh example, where environmental movements are raging on, and they're raging on multiple fronts. There's a huge amount of knowledge that's being generated by activists every day as they're negotiating with the state and other actors and other constellations of power. Consider, for instance, Professor Anu Muhammad, who's a scholar, and Rizwana Hassan, who's a lawyer at the helm of a long-standing environmental organization. Both have engaged in significant grassroots work and excavated new knowledge in this domain. And on the other hand, you also have scientific research that's coming out against, for example, research on sedimentation rates of mangrove forests. So mangrove forests and building of a coal power plant in Bangladesh has been, in the last several years, this has been an issue. It's generated protests, right? But these actors are actually spread out and don't necessarily, they're working towards the same goal, but don't necessarily engage with some of the groundwork, right? So this renders some of the formal knowledge incomplete. If there was a way to connect these disparate sites and disciplines through a common platform, especially in the context of framing a movement or a policy, it would be immensely useful for the scholarly world. And this model could work across geographies. So there's no reason why a movement in South Africa cannot learn from one that's happening in Colombia and vice versa. So we want to address this knowledge deficit of existing models and connect the ground up data, right? We want to go through a range of methods to build knowledge and gather data from the ground up through local and informal sites of knowledge, and then connect them to formal institutional networks. Now, we are also aware that the informal knowledge systems have their own challenges, but the idea really is to learn from them and empower them further rather than to disregard them totally. So recognizing these challenges and also informed by our own work that has engaged with communities over time, and I've provided some pictures there, we have planned a number of components. One is a curating component. It'll create a comprehensive online and accessible repository. We will create a database of non-academic spaces of knowledge production. We will map regulatory frameworks and create a database on academic freedom, freedom of speech, restrictions on funding for NGOs and research organizations, national security laws, which seem to be on the rise, and we will map scholars at risk. The research component, it includes organizing workshops, which we want to host under a consortium, which is already beginning to come together given our network. And these will operate from regional hubs from Latin America to Africa and Greater Asia. And we will also collaborate with Global North scholars. The goal is to support communities within and beyond academia, and equipping them with research tools, conceptual apparatus, language, and publish contextually. The workshops will then engage with emerging research questions, methods, and research ethics, and will also generate research papers, syllabi, and provide feedback by connecting junior and senior scholars. The network created out of these activities will facilitate knowledge dissemination, engage in advocacy with global policy actors, and establish links beyond social sciences and humanities. So one background condition that we need to contend with is the rise of authoritarianism. It could sometimes operate at the state level or even pockets of institutions. Authoritarianism will reinforces the divide and gatekeeping between formal and tacit knowledge. The COVID-19 pandemic is a good example. It witnessed the world united in tragedy, but it also revealed significant disparities in access, resource distribution, and knowledge sharing. Especially when the vaccines were getting rolled out. Governments around the world actually used this opportunity to consolidate power. They suppressed dissent from activists, academics, and even public health officials. And some of these revelations came from outside the academy at a much faster pace. And these conditions affected the global north too. Take the US as an example, right? The trust between public institutions and citizens was fundamentally breached during this pandemic, and it showed a disconnect between where knowledge is and where understanding is. Even in the university-centric models of the global north, where we assume strong links among stable public institutions, a weak link between these institutions and communities can lead to instabilities. Therefore, studying the impact of authoritarianism is useful in all contexts. The global south then provides fertile grounds to study how we can unify knowledge systems and make them more resilient. These systems operate in conditions where there are weak links among state institutions and between local and received knowledge, but strong links between scholaractivists and communities can yield unexpected results. It may be some of the best sites for innovation that works and could even provide an antidote to authoritarianism. So one of our hopes is that this project helps build legacies and shapes alternative futures. In the global south, where we're claiming knowledge resides in the intersection of overlapping and often informal fields, legacy building becomes challenging. Institutions are built around particular individuals. Knowledge is neither systematized nor institutionalized or carried forth. And building knowledge systems takes generations. And the task ahead of us is intergenerational, to build knowledge commons and reinforce the power of community. And in laying the foundations for knowledge to flourish in the global south, we paid close attention to agency of global south scholars. If we continue to deploy modes of analysis that we recognize have blind spots and that don't take into account our values, experiences, worldviews, and agency, then we must be forced to accept and reinforce scholarly perspectives that don't see us or Southern realities. So this project is unconventional. It's simultaneously self-reflexive and generative. We are both the researchers and the subjects of our study. As first-generation academics from the global south, we've faced this disconnect between traditional academy and our experiences. So displaying this unconventional idea required some courage and some madness, and we may be asking our jury to take a leap of faith. So regardless of the outcome, the project selection as a finalist already reassures us. We feel heard, and for this reason alone, we especially thank the jury. Thank you very much.